Avoidants aren't afraid of your silence. They're afraid of why it suddenly feels peaceful. Because here's the truth no one tells you. At the beginning of no contact, the avoidant actually feels lighter. Your absence gives them exactly what their nervous system has been begging for: space, distance, room to breathe. To them, silence initially feels like freedom. It feels like control. It feels like the pressure finally lifted off their chest. They don't interpret your silence as a signal, they interpret it as relief. And for a while, they lean into that relief like it's a warm, familiar coping mechanism. But then something subtle starts to shift. Not overnight, not dramatically, not in some romantic movie moment. No, it happens in the quiet cracks of their day, a random evening, a break in their routine, a moment their mind finally stops running. All of a sudden, the silence they once found soothing starts to feel different. It doesn't feel like space anymore. It feels like absence. It feels like something missing, not something avoided. And that tiny internal shift, that's the very first trigger that begins the slow unraveling of their emotional distance. Because for avoidance, silence has always been a shield. It lets them stay in control. It lets them regulate their emotions without anyone watching. But what happens when silence stops working? What happens when the quiet that used to protect them now feels too quiet? When the world feels a little emptier than it did before? This is the moment that catches them off guard. They don't plan it, they don't expect it. It just hits. At first, they won't admit it, especially not to themselves. They'll look for any explanation other than the real one. I'm just tired, I'm stressed, I'm busy. They'll try to rationalize away the feeling that something is off. But the truth is this: they can feel the emotional thread between you loosening. And avoidants don't panic when you pull away. They panic when they sense that you've stopped waiting. And this is where the deeper psychology kicks in. Avoidants are used to people fighting for their closeness. They're used to being the one who pulls back and still being chased. It's the dynamic they unconsciously expect. But when you go silent, truly silent, and you stay silent, you break their pattern. You remove the predictability they rely on, and suddenly, silence stops feeling like control. It feels like lost territory. At this stage, they start noticing the small things: the lack of your name popping up on their phone, the absence of your energy in their daily life, the missing reassurance they never admitted they depended on. And because avoidance lives so much internally, the shift becomes loud inside their mind, even if it stays quiet outside. The silence becomes a mirror, reflecting not their freedom, but the reality that you are no longer orbiting around them. And that's the exact moment their nervous system flips. The distance that once felt safe starts feeling risky. The quiet starts feeling unstable. And even though they won't reach out yet, the seed has already been planted. Why does this silence feel different? Why do I feel uneasy? Why does it feel like they're not coming back? This is the moment avoidants decide, deep down, that something is changing. Maybe they're losing you. Maybe the silence is no longer about them. Maybe you've reclaimed your emotional power. And even though they won't show it immediately, this is the precise psychological shift that becomes the very first internal push. The beginning of the moment an avoidant starts thinking about reaching out. The avoidant panic doesn't start when you pull away. It starts when you stop chasing. Most people misunderstand this part of the avoidant psyche. They think the avoidant becomes anxious the moment distance enters the relationship. But that's not how avoidants are wired. Distance is their comfort zone. Pulling back is familiar. Emotional space feels like relief, not danger. What actually rattles an avoidant is when the predictable emotional pattern they've relied on suddenly disappears. And for many avoidants, you were that predictability. And your reactions gave them a strange kind of safety, even in conflict. Your responses told them the bond was still intact. Even when they withdrew, even when they created emotional space, they knew exactly what to expect. You would reach out, check in, reassure, pursue, or at least show some kind of emotional presence. It didn't matter if it was a message, a question, a concern, a sign of frustration. All of it told them they still mattered, that the connection still existed, that they were still wanted. But when you stop reacting, when you stop giving them emotional feedback of any kind, that's when the avoidant feels something they don't know how to handle: uncertainty. Your silence becomes information, Your neutrality becomes a message, your absence becomes loud. Suddenly, they no longer know where they stand with you. The script they've been unconsciously following, the push pull cycle they've lived in for years, starts breaking apart. And here's the part they don't admit: avoidants build emotional expectations just as much as anxious or secure partners do. They just build them quietly. They memorize your patterns. They notice how you respond to distance. They subconsciously depend on those responses. So when your energy detaches, it hits their nervous system like a missing signal. Something that used to be constant is suddenly gone. And the avoidant mind doesn't respond with clarity, it responds with confusion. This confusion turns into doubt. Doubt turns into curiosity. And curiosity slowly starts turning into fear. Not the explosive, dramatic fear of losing someone. Avoidants don't experience it that way. It's subtle, it's quiet, it creeps in through small questions that they can't shake off. Did they give up? Are they done putting in effort? Are they moving on? And the biggest one, did I lose them? This is the thought that changes everything. Because once an avoidant starts wondering if they've lost access to you, the emotional power dynamic flips. The distance that used to feel like safety starts feeling like uncertainty. The silence that felt controlled now feels unpredictable. And unpredictability to an avoidant is deeply uncomfortable. It makes them hyper aware of the connection in a way they didn't expect. So they start checking in from a distance, not reaching out yet, but observing. They look at your activity, they notice what you're not doing, they interpret your lack of reaction as the first sign you're not tied to them anymore. And that's the moment they emotionally shift, not because you pulled away, but because for the first time, you didn't follow. Avoidants don't reach out because they miss you. They reach out when a memory finally breaks. They're defenses. And this moment rarely happens during the dramatic parts of the relationship. It doesn't hit them when you walk away, when you stop texting, or when the silence begins. It hits later, unexpectedly, when their guard is down and their distractions aren't strong enough to protect them anymore. Avoidants are experts at emotional suppression. They can shut down feelings with precision, bury memories beneath routine, and convince themselves that distance is the best option. But even avoidants have emotional pressure points. And all it takes is one memory, one tiny harmless moment to slip through the cracks they thought were sealed shut. It's never the grand memory that gets them. It's always something small. A particular laugh they hear from someone else that sounds just like yours, a familiar expression someone makes, a song in the background of a cafe, the scent of a perfume or cologne you once wore, maybe even a phrase you used to say that they suddenly remember in the middle of a random day. And at first, it seems like nothing, just a flicker, just a passing thought. But that's the thing. Avoidants don't miss you the way others do. They don't sit and consciously reflect. They don't indulge in longing. They feel impact, not nostalgia. And when that memory hits, it hits like a pressure they can't immediately numb. The emotional wall they've built so carefully begins to crack, not because the memory is sentimental, but because it reconnects them to a part of themselves they haven't accessed since you've been gone. Avoidants don't just miss the person, they miss the version of themselves they were with that person. A softer version, a more open version, a version that felt connected in a way they secretly crave but struggle to maintain. And that sudden reconnection to emotion creates discomfort, a quiet ache, a sense of loss they can't logically explain away. This is the moment when avoidance stops working. Their usual coping tools, distraction, work, hobbies, silence, don't feel as effective. The memory lingers. It pulls at them. It makes the distance feel heavier. And avoidants hate emotional heaviness. They'll try to shake it off. They'll try to force themselves back into detachment. They'll remind themselves why they pulled away in the first place. But the mind doesn't forget what the heart has stored. And that memory is now alive, echoing in places they don't like to explore. This is when the emotional suppression they rely on begins to erode. They start replaying the moment, not intentionally, but because it has emotional residue. And for an avoidant, emotional residue is dangerous. It forces awareness. It forces feeling. It forces clarity. Suddenly they're aware of the loss, aware of the absence, aware that someone is missing from their daily life in a way they hadn't felt until now. And that's why this moment matters, because this is the moment avoidants stop being numb and start being human again. When the memory breaks through, it doesn't just remind them of you, it reminds them of the connection they tried to outrun. Avoidants love space until space stops feeling like power. In the beginning, independence is their sanctuary. The moment they pull back, they feel an immediate rush of relief, like they've escaped pressure, avoided conflict, and reclaimed control. It feels clean. It feels safe. It feels like they've returned to the emotional environment their nervous system understands best: distance. And for a while, they settle comfortably into that distance, convincing themselves it was the right choice, the only choice, the choice that keeps them stable. This is the honeymoon phase of solitude, and avoidants drink it in like oxygen. But solitude has an expiration date they never see coming. The same independence that once felt empowering slowly begins to lose its shine. The distractions that used to fill the silence, work, hobbies, scrolling, gaming, staying busy, stop providing the emotional numbness they're designed for. Their routines feel repetitive. Their environment feels too quiet. Their inner world feels heavier, and avoidants hate heaviness more than anything. They're not afraid of being alone. They're afraid of realizing they're lonely. There comes a moment, sometimes small, sometimes overwhelming, when the avoidant sits in their quiet apartment or walks through their day and suddenly feels the emotional cost of the distance they created. It's subtle at first. A flicker, an emptiness they can't explain, a sense that something is missing, even though they arranged their life to minimize emotional demands. But the truth is simple: distance didn't protect them, it didn't prevent discomfort. It didn't make intimacy safer. All it did was amplify the presence of the one person who isn't there anymore. Avoidants don't register this as missing someone right away. They frame it as boredom, restlessness, or lack of stimulation. But underneath those shallow labels sits the deeper truth they're not ready to name. The independence they fought so hard to preserve no longer feels grounding. It feels hollow. They don't feel powerful. They feel disconnected. They don't feel free. They feel adrift. An emotional disconnect is something an avoidant can manage only when they believe the connection is still available, when they believe they can return whenever they feel ready. But if they sense that your energy has shifted, that the door might not be open anymore, the independence they once celebrated suddenly becomes terrifying. This is the stage where self-protection turns into self-awareness. They begin to realize that the space they created didn't shield them from loss. It created the loss. And the absence of your presence becomes more noticeable than the relief of your distance. They replay conversations. They remember your warmth. They recall the emotional comfort you provided, even when they kept their walls high. It dawns on them that they haven't just lost a person. They've lost the emotional version of themselves that only existed with you. And this is where loneliness takes root. Not loud, dramatic loneliness, but the quiet kind that creeps in at night, in slow moments, in unexpected pauses. The kind of loneliness that makes solitude feel less like safety and more like the aftermath of pushing away someone who mattered. The avoidant reaches out when they realize you closed the door. They left half open, because that's exactly what avoidants do. They don't end things cleanly. They don't shut the door fully. They don't walk away with certainty. They leave the connection slightly ajar, just enough for them to slip back in whenever they feel ready. To an avoidant, this half-open door is emotional insurance. It allows them to stay distant without feeling like they've truly lost you. And they maintain it not through commitment, but through crumbs, tiny signals that keep the connection in limbo, soft enough to avoid intimacy, but warm enough to feel safe. But here's where the dynamic shifts: when you stop breadcrumbing, when you stop liking their posts, stop watching their stories, stop sending a casual "how are you" every few days, stop leaving small pieces of reassurance for them to feed on. When the tiny signs of interest, attention, and emotional availability disappear, they notice, and avoidants notice quietly but deeply. They scan for patterns even if they never admit it. And your breadcrumbs were part of a pattern that kept them grounded, even when they seemed indifferent. At first, your silence, after no contact, meant nothing to them. But over time, the absence of your microsignals becomes louder than any message you could have sent. Avoidants rely on the subtle proof that you're still emotionally tethered to them. Every view, every check-in was confirmation that the connection was still alive, still accessible, still waiting. But when those signals suddenly stop, when you remove the emotional crumbs they've grown used to collecting, that's when the avoidant starts feeling something they don't handle well: urgency. Avoidants don't chase people, but they do chase access. And when they sense access slipping away, it triggers a response far more powerful than longing or nostalgia. It triggers fear. Not fear of intimacy, but fear of losing a connection they assumed would remain indefinitely. For them, your lack of breadcrumbs isn't just silence. It's a shift in emotional power. It's a signal that you're not hanging on the way you used to. It's proof that the dynamic they relied on has changed. This is where their mind starts racing in quiet, anxious circles. Why aren't they reacting? Why did they stop watching my stories? Why isn't their name popping up anymore? Did they move on? And the deeper thought they won't dare to speak. Did I underestimate them? This is the point where the avoidant realizes they might actually lose the person who always felt emotionally consistent, emotionally present. And losing access feels like losing safety. Not the kind that comes from closeness, but the kind that comes from knowing someone will always be there if they decide to return. And that shift, the moment you stop giving them the emotional breadcrumbs they assumed would never run out, becomes the internal pressure that pushes them closer to reaching out. Because for the first time, the door they left half open isn't just drifting shut on its own. You closed it, and avoidants hate losing access to doors they thought belonged to them forever. Nothing jolts an avoidant like watching you become the version of yourself they always feared someone else would get. Avoidants don't panic when you're hurt, confused, or reaching for them. In fact, that dynamic keeps them comfortable. It reinforces their emotional safety. As long as you're waiting, hoping, or trying, they still feel in control. They know the connection is intact. They know they still matter. They know they're still wanted. But the moment they sense you're healing, growing, grounding yourself in your own power, that's the moment everything flips. Fear of intimacy quietly transforms into fear of replacement, and that shift hits them harder than any silence ever could. Avoidants are highly perceptive, even if they pretend not to be. They notice changes in energy. They notice when your tone becomes calmer, when your presence becomes lighter, when your patterns stop revolving around them. They notice when your attention no longer leaks in their direction. They notice when you're not as emotionally available as you once were. And they especially notice when you start showing signs of emotional independence, the kind that used to scare them, but now threatens their sense of importance. This is where your glow up, your healing, your soft stability becomes a threat to their detachment. Not because they don't want you to heal, not because they don't want you to feel good, but because healing means you're changing the emotional equation. You're no longer someone who needs them, you're someone who can choose them. And avoidants are far more afraid of being unchosen than they are of closeness itself. When they see you laughing more, posting better, taking care of yourself, getting clearer, getting stronger, it wakes up a part of them they tried to keep buried, but a part that remembers what it felt like to be connected. A part that realizes you're becoming the version of yourself they always valued but couldn't fully receive. And that realization stings because healing doesn't just represent growth, it represents possibility, the possibility that someone else will see your worth, the possibility that someone else will get the version of you the avoidant was never ready for, the possibility that they're losing more than a person, they're losing access to a future that could have been theirs. They start questioning everything. Who are they becoming? Why do they seem happier? Are they over me? Have they finally moved on? And the question they fear the most, did I wait too long? This is the moment avoidants confront the consequences of their distance. Healing, confidence, and emotional clarity from you force them to face the truth that they never expected. You were not stuck. You were not frozen. You were not waiting in emotional limbo. You were evolving. That evolution activates a new form of urgency inside them. Not desperation, but realization the connection they took for granted might not be within reach anymore. And that's the switch. Fear of intimacy dissolves, Fear of losing you rises. That's the moment an avoidant reaches out, not because you're broken, but because you stopped being breakable. Avoidants don't reach out because they're ready. They reach out because running stopped working. Every avoidant lives inside a predictable emotional cycle, even if they're not conscious of it. It always begins with the push, that instinctive pullback when vulnerability gets too close, too real, or too risky. This push isn't rejection, it's a nervous system reaction. Their emotional walls rise, their independence kicks in, and they create distance to feel safe again. And once they've pulled back, they slide into the next part of the pattern, distance. Distance is their comfort zone. When they step away, they feel the tension release, they feel regulated again, the emotional intensity drops. In this stage, they tell themselves stories. I needed space. I'm fine alone. This is better. And because avoidants are masters at minimizing their own feelings, the relief feels genuine. This is the part of the cycle that convinces them the pattern works. But relief is only temporary, and they don't realize that yet. After a while, the emotional fog clears, and the next stage quietly creeps in, doubt. This is where their mind starts bringing up questions they don't want to examine. Did I overreact? Why do I still think about them? Why doesn't this feel as good as it used to? The emotional numbness that distance provided begins to fade, and with it comes awareness. The awareness that nothing actually improved. The problem didn't go away, the bond didn't dissolve, the feelings didn't vanish, they only buried them. And when doubts grow loud enough, the cycle inevitably shifts into the most vulnerable stage of all, longing. Longing for the emotional connection they pushed away. Longing for the comfort of your presence. Longing for the familiarity, the softness, the safety they once felt with you, even if they couldn't sustain it in real time. Avoidants don't show this outwardly. They feel it internally, quietly, almost painfully. And this is the stage where their defenses start collapsing. The coping mechanism that once protected them now feels like the very thing that's hurting them. This is what it means when the avoidance cycle breaks. It's not dramatic. It's not a sudden transformation. It's the moment they realize that the distance they chose didn't bring peace. It brought emptiness. The space they thought was protecting them ended up isolating them. And the relief they felt in the beginning can't compete with the quiet ache that grows each day. You're gone. This realization hits harder than any argument or breakup because it forces them to confront the truth they've been running from. Running doesn't solve anything. Running doesn't erase connection. Running doesn't override attachment. When the cycle reaches this last stage, avoidants face the first crack in their pattern, the moment where the urge to stay distant weakens and the desire to reconnect becomes stronger than their fear of vulnerability. This is the psychological tipping point. The moment silence stops being comfortable. The moment self-protection starts feeling like self-sabotage. And that's when they reach out, not because they're fully healed, not because they suddenly understand their emotions, but because the cycle that once kept them safe has finally stopped working. Avoidants don't reach out for connection. They reach out for emotional safety. Avoidants don't break their silence randomly. They don't wake up one day and suddenly decide to be vulnerable. And they definitely don't reach out because they miss you in the typical emotionally expressive way most people imagine. For an avoidant, silence isn't just a pause, it's protection. It's the space where they regulate, calm their nervous system, and convince themselves they're still in control. But there comes a moment, rare, quiet, powerful, when staying silent feels more dangerous than reaching out. It's the moment where emotional safety shifts, where silence no longer feels like strength, and vulnerability no longer feels like a threat. It's the moment they feel safer talking to you than hiding from you. Here's what triggers that internal tipping point. They start to worry that the distance is no longer working in their favor. At first, they expect you to fill the silence because that's the pattern they're used to. You reach out, you soften the tension, you reassure them that the connection is still alive. But when you don't, when you hold steady, actually got when you don't chase, when your silence is calm rather than reactive, that's when something unfamiliar happens inside their mind. Their fear of intimacy slowly becomes smaller than their fear of losing the one person who actually makes them feel safe. Avoidants don't reach out because they suddenly become secure. They reach out because your energy, your presence, your consistency created a pocket of safety they're not used to. And losing you starts to feel like a bigger risk than letting you closer. Suddenly, silence doesn't give them control anymore. Silence now feels like What if they're moving on? What if they feel more peaceful without me? What if they won't be there when I'm finally ready? What if this distance breaks the connection instead of protecting it? Those thoughts aren't loud in their brain. They're subtle, but unavoidable, and they grow stronger the longer the silence goes on. Eventually, they reach a moment that every avoidant has but rarely admit. Reaching out feels safer than staying silent because staying silent now threatens the very thing they've been quietly holding on to. Because reaching out, even in a small, indirect, casual way, gives them a feeling they crave but never know how to ask for: a return to emotional stability. This is the moment avoidance: send the hey text, reply to an old thread, watch your stories again, or create an excuse to reconnect. It's not impulsive, it's not random, it's not accidental. It's the shift where emotional safety moves from distance to connection. And when an avoidant crosses that threshold, that's when they come back. Not because they're healed, but because with you, silence finally became the scarier option. Avoidants don't miss people in the typical sense. They don't sit around romanticizing the connection, replaying every detail, or longing for your presence in a sentimental way, at least not at first. What they miss is the version of themselves they were able to access when they were with you. Avoidants often spend their life feeling misunderstood, misinterpreted, or emotionally wrong, too distant, too private, too complicated, too hard to read. Most people don't sit with them long enough to understand that their distance is not rejection, it's self protection. But you did. You didn't just connect with them, you understood them. You didn't force closeness, you allowed space. You didn't demand emotional expression, you made room for it. And whether they admitted it or not, that gave them access to a softer version of themselves, a calmer version, a version that didn't need to brace for emotional impact. Avoidants rarely get to experience that. So when the distance grows and the silence stretches and they fall back into their old emotional patterns, they start to realize something subtle but powerful. They don't like the version of themselves they become without you. Without your presence, they return to that guarded, hyper independent mode, the one built from old wounds and childhood survival strategies. At first, they tell themselves it's fine. They convince themselves they're good, safe, in control, but eventually they feel the contrast. With you, they didn't feel defective. With you, their emotions didn't feel dangerous. With you, they didn't feel like they were too much or not enough. With you, they could breathe. And when an avoidant loses access to that feeling, that's when the longing begins. Not longing for a relationship, longing for the internal safety they experienced around you, longing for the emotional version of themselves that was allowed to exist only in your presence. They miss the way you made them feel, less guarded, less anxious, less alone inside their own head. They miss the ease, the moments where connection didn't feel like a threat. They miss the safety, the sense that someone finally got them. They miss the peace, the rare break from emotional overthinking. Avoidants aren't drawn back by pressure. They aren't moved by ultimatums. They aren't changed by force. But they are pulled by memory, especially the memory of emotional clarity they can't recreate with anyone else. That memory sits quietly in the back of their mind, tapping them on the shoulder. It's not dramatic. It's not sudden. It's not loud. It's just persistent. Eventually, they realized it wasn't just the relationship that mattered. It was who they got to be in it. And that's the moment avoidants return, not to reclaim you, but to reconnect with the version of themselves they can't find anywhere else. Avoidants don't come back when you wait. They come back when you finally stop